Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. I'm so excited for you guys to join me on this conversation with Marc Mawhinney. Marc is a podcaster and a coach who helps other coaches. Now, Marc has a podcast called Natural Born Coaches, which we'll put a link into the show notes, as well as has a Facebook group called The Coaching Jungle. So if anybody out there has been thinking about creating a coaching business themselves, Marc is a resource that I strongly recommend that you check out. Now, Marc is a great guy that I enjoy talking baseball with, enjoy talking hockey with, and basically life in general. We go back and forth on Facebook quite a bit with some comments back and forth, and he's just a great guy that I've been able to meet through all this technology we have. I've been able to get to know him through his podcast. I've been able to connect with him on Facebook, as well as have this upcoming awesome conversation with him. And then after you've listened to this, what I want you to do is definitely subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done that already, and then go ahead and share it with some friends, because these stories about grandfathers, and Marc's story in particular, is very impactful. It tells us so much, not just about the relationship between grandfathers and grandsons and granddaughters, but also just relationships in general. I hope you're ready to get yourself a beverage, pull up a chair, and join Marc and I for an awesome conversation. Hello, and welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. This is your host, Greg Payne, coming at you from Studio 12. This podcast is about being the best possible grandpa you can be, focusing on what it is to be a grandpa and how we can all share that experience together for our grandchildren. Thank you, Marc, for being on the Cool Grandpa Podcast. I really do appreciate you taking time out of your day to sit down with me and have a conversation about your grandfathers.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. In full disclosure, I'm not a grandfather yet, but I like to speak about my grandfather. He was a great man. So thank you for having me.
Sure. Now, as we get started, how about you introduce your grandfather to us and talk a little bit about his background and what you remember about his story? Sure.
So I grew up in a small seaside community in Atlantic, Canada. I'm still in Atlantic, Canada. I'm no longer in that small birthplace, but it was called Maces Bay, and beautiful spot. But I was born, won't go into my whole life story, but basically we lived next door to my grandparents. They lived across the field.
Okay.
So when my father he got married, my grandfather had several pieces of land, and he gave my father and his brother choice who wants what piece of land and stuff. And anyways, my father got the land next door to my grandparents, which I'm very grateful for. It was right on the ocean, the Bay of Fundy, kind of an idyllic atmosphere, great place to grow up, playing on the beach, in the woods. You could live that country life. And we spent a lot of time next door to my grandparents. So my grandfather was Marc Mawhinney, and he was a fisherman, and he did some farming as well off season, but he was primarily a fisherman. And my grandmother was Janet Mawhinney, and we were very close to them. So he was born, I believe, in 1921, and he passed away in November 17th of 1993. At the age of 72, which at the time seemed normal. Nowadays, 72 seems very young for someone to pass away. But back then, that seemed to be par for the course. And that was the first death that I'd ever experienced in my life. I was 15 years old when that happened. Wow.
Yeah, and to be that close to your grandfather had to have been a pretty emotional experience at that point. It's not that distant relationship where hey, you see your grandfather every so often, and then, you might attend a funeral, but
yeah,
wow.
He was very engaged. So for example, I have a twin brother, Matt, and Matt and I had a paper route that we would do as kids back in junior high school. And of course, it could get very cold and bad weather in Canada certain times of the year. Our grandfather used to drive us around on the really bad days, you know, and I can remember even waiting for the school bus. We're standing at the bottom of the driveway across from the Bay of Fundy with the vapor just flying off the ocean in those cold February mornings. He would drive over in his car, be all warmed up. We would hop in the car and wait for the bus, you know, to come. He used to play baseball with us. You know, at that time, cool. He would have been probably in his late 60s. Playing baseball, huge Toronto Blue Jays fan, which I am as well. And I'm very grateful he got to witness, I'm sorry to say this, I think you're a Braves fan. He got to witness the 1992 World Series that the Jays beat the Braves. Sorry about that. No. But you guys have won others. So you got the monkey off your back. But and also he passed away just after the Jays won their second straight World Series in 1993 against the Philadelphia Phillies. And literally just a couple weeks after that World Series is when he passed away. So I'm grateful that he got to see that second World Series. I'm very happy about that.
Yeah, isn't it interesting, though, when you've got family members that are lifelong whatever fans, and it seems like if they can make it through a championship, if there's been a drought or there hasn't been a championship, that it just means so much more that they got to see that, you know, they got to enjoy it.
Well, I was very happy when, I've never been happy when the Red Sox win anything. They're not as bad as the Yankees. Sorry to any New York Yankees fans. But when the Red Sox won their World Series after that huge drought that they had and the whole, you know, Babe Ruth curse and stuff, I was happy that a lot of the old folks, you know, the old timers got to see that. Same thing with the Chicago Cubs, you know, a few years back when they shook the Billy Goat curse, you know. So you feel really good when you see these fans who've been a fan since they were just toddlers or kids that had to go a whole lifetime watching their team never winning, and then bang, it happens. You know, that's pretty cool to see.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting experience, especially for diehard sports fans. You know, when if you grow up in some of those cities where they haven't won championships since the 30s or never, you know, it becomes this identity, and sometimes you just want to hang on and you hope for it. But some folks never have that opportunity to see that championship come around.
Exactly. Well, on the hockey side of things, I'm a Toronto Maple Leafs fan. I was born in '78. The Leafs haven't won since 1967. So my whole life, I really don't want to be talking to you when I'm 80 years old and saying, I really hope the Leafs would win. You know, they have a good team this year, so who knows what could happen. But yeah, that's it's one of the reasons why I'm glad to see professional sports back now with COVID. I say back. I know they played last year. I don't consider sports to be back if there's cardboard cutouts in the stands or empty seats. You know, I loved seeing the Texas or stadium filled and fans cheering and baseball back this year, because baseball really pulls people together, and sports do in general, you know, all sports with it. And a lot of people just say, oh, it's someone with a bat and a ball, got a bunch of grown men chasing a ball around. No, it's much more than that.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, I'm a Washington Caps fan, grew up in the D.C. area, and it was a couple of years ago that the Caps finally got over that hurdle.
That's right.
And finally won. And even though I wasn't in town, I was so happy to see everybody outside in the streets, jumping up and down, celebrating, and getting that monkey off of our back. You're absolutely right. There's something about, it's not a true event, you know, sporting event or family reunion or whatever, if you can't get everybody together and you can't have that shared experience. It's just not the same. And I felt that way about the Dodgers winning last year too. I mean, they won in Texas Stadium, away from fans. You know, great for the team, but not so great for the fans and that shared community.
Yeah, it's interesting in Canada because, of course, we only have one baseball team now, the Toronto Blue Jays, since the Expos are gone. And I guess they're in your neck of the woods now, the whole Nationals, or your old neck of the woods with Washington. But it's interesting because I'm on the East Coast. I'm quite a drive away from Toronto. In a lot of ways, I'm closer probably to the New England states, with the Red Sox and stuff. But the Blue Jays are Canada's team. Wherever you're at in Canada, then you're rooting for the Jays. And I get up to Toronto, once, twice a year in normal years, not COVID years. Sure. With it. And so my grandfather was really cool that way, where you wouldn't think that a fisherman from the east coast of Canada would be a huge baseball fan, but he really loved the Blue Jays.
Well, I'm sure when he was on the water, he had a lot of time to listen to the radio and, coming in and out.
Exactly. Yeah. Listening to the play-by-play on the radio. So
now, what were some of your earliest memories of your grandfather? I know that he lived next door. Was it something where coming home from elementary school, you'd run over there and you guys would get together and do some activities? I know he was still probably working at that time.
Yeah, so I remember a lot of things with it. One thing he liked to do with my brother and I is bounce us up and down on his knees. So my grandfather was a really stocky fellow. His hands were huge and stuff. He was different. My brother and I aren't like that and built that way. But when we were young, toddlers, he would bounce us up and down on his knee. He used to always chew juicy fruit gum. It's funny what you remember, right? When you can smell juicy fruit gum when he was doing it. He also used to, he was really good woodworking. He had a garage where he would putter around, and he actually created really cool replicas of fishing ships, boats. With it. So I actually just saw it because my father has two of them at his place. And those boats actually have everything they've done to scale. They got the little cubby holes, and they got, everything that you would see in an actual fishing boat with it. He had an actual fishing boat that he took out in the water, and it was called the Mathew and Marc. So Matthew's my brother. And there's no Luke or John.
Okay.
People say, where's Luke and John? Just Mathew and Marc. With it. So yeah, that was kind of cool, just little things like that. But I do remember us running across the field often, because we played baseball between the two houses. That was our baseball field. I also remember breaking his basement window once with a line drive that was pulled too far down the third baseline of our field or whatever. And he never said anything about it. That was okay, boys, don't worry about it,
Oh, wow. How did that make you feel? Because at the moment, were you thinking, oh boy, I'm in trouble?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's probably the worst feeling for a young boy playing baseball, is you put a ball through anyone's window, but especially your grandparents that were, so good. So one of the interesting things which ties into podcasting with my grandfather, and I may have told you the story when we chatted off air a few weeks ago. So I launched my podcast, Natural Born Coaches, in 2014, November of 2014. So when I decided to launch a show, it was going to be a daily show. So right now it's a weekly frequency. We're at 700 and some episodes, but back in the first year it was a daily show. So at that time I thought, okay, I should make the launch date the 1st of January 2015, because it's going to be way too tight. I started planning this in October of 2014 is when we got rolling with recordings and so on. Everyone said there's no way you can get a daily show ready because you're going to need probably 30 episodes in the can. You got to do all this stuff. And most people thought January would be pushing it. What I decided to do was I said, I'm going to launch a show November 17th of 2014. And I chose that date because my grandfather passed away November 17th of 1993 as a way to honor him. And I can tell you that I hit that deadline literally midnight the night before, the 16th at midnight. So hours before launch, I got everything ready and to go. We almost didn't hit it. But I would not have hit that deadline if not for my grandfather. So anytime I was falling behind pace and I was thinking, oh, geez, I don't think I should do this. Maybe I should push it back to January. I felt guilty. I felt like I was dishonoring him in a way, or his memory. And I just pushed to get it going. So I always tell people my grandfather helped me launch my podcast, even though he had been dead and buried for, over 20 years, 21 years by the time that happened.
Right. Did he ever seem like he was a guy that was just driven on his own with his own energy? And, being a fisherman, he probably was to an extent, but I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, that community, I'm sure it's this way with fishermen and people that work with, farmers as well and stuff like that. They have that work ethic ingrained in them, but they don't make a big show of it. So they're not the types, if they were around nowadays, to be going on Facebook talking about hustle, grind, 24/7 and showboating on social media. So he was up early. Like they were out the water the wee hours of the morning, with the cold, the air. Just I am not a fisher. I've never fished a day in my life, and I would be horrible out there. I have no desire to do that. But yeah, he was very much a hard worker, very religious, like I say very religious, Bible, had the Bible around the house, and, church on Sunday, and, we go to Sunday school with him and stuff like that. So it's just, it's almost a, you get a little nostalgic looking back at that generation because it's so different now. But I get really good feelings because there's a really heavy emphasis on family. You get out, you provide a way of life, a standard of living for your family, but there's no fuss or anything like that. They don't complain. They just get out there and they get it done. And that's what's, I think, missing a lot of cases nowadays in 2021. You don't really see that as much.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. And part of the reasoning behind the question is just having seen that example day in and day out as you were growing up. I'm wondering if that really, and it's all conjecture, but if that really played a part into, here's my date. Once you settled on trying to hit that anniversary date, if it was hell or high water, I'm going to hit this date, and there's no sliding, there's no excuses, there's no anything. This is how it's going to be, and this is just the drive of I'm doing whatever it takes to hit that date, because that's kind of the work ethic and the example that you just absorb day in and day out.
Yeah, I think family is very important for motivation. Don't get me wrong, I love money. I've made no secret of that, but digits in a bank account, it's hard sometimes for that to drive you all the time. But if you're doing something, let's say you're building a business because you want to be able to hand it off to your kids when you're older and they're old enough to do it, or you are building something to provide for a sick parent, for example, or something like that, that can be a very powerful motivator. Actually, there is something that happened just days before my grandfather died. I'll share a short story, and,
Sure.
because I think there's a lesson that people could take from it. So it was a Saturday morning, and I remember my mom was washing dishes, and the window in the kitchen looked across the field at my grandparents' house. And my grandfather was in the garage there, sitting on a old stool, just whittling on some wood. And my mom said to my brother and I, she said, why don't you guys go over and, say hi to your grandfather? Now, us being 15-year-old kids, we weren't 5 anymore and stuff. And we're like, well, yeah, we'll do it later, Mom, or whatever. God knows what we were doing. And she said something to me. She said, your grandfather's not going to be around forever, and you're going to wish that you had done that. So my brother and I ended up going over to my grandfather that Saturday morning in November. And we were just chatting about baseball because he had seen the Blue Jays win shortly before. That was Saturday morning, and we talked to him probably for half an hour or whatever. And that was that. The next day, or the next evening, actually, a Sunday evening, he was rushed into the hospital. The ambulance came down. We're like, what's going on? We're just, and Grampy was sick, or he was being taken to the hospital. I'm like, well, gee, we just saw him yesterday in the garage. He was fine. And he ended up passing away the Wednesday morning, just a few days after. When he was supposed to come back from the hospital, they said he's fine, he's coming home. Something happened, there's complications, and we got off the school bus on that Wednesday, the 17th, and he's dead and gone. So I'm very grateful that my mom pushed us to go over there that Saturday. It didn't seem like a big deal at the time, but I'm glad that we got to have that kind of last time with him, even though we did see him in the hospital before he passed away a few days later with it. So the lesson there is life's short. You never know when someone's time is going to be up, yours or someone else's. And I know it sounds cliche, kind of like a Hallmark card, but don't waste those moments. Take advantage of your loved ones, because it could end really quickly. And that's something that's always stuck with me about my grandfather as well.
Yeah, no, what a great story, because, there would have been a ton of regret had you guys just, shrugged off your mom's advice and gone and did whatever. And, at least you've got that memory of, you saw him in his element, right? He's on a stool, he's whittling, he's in the garage, he's, dressed however he's dressed.
Yeah.
And that's the memory you take away.
Yeah, exactly. So, it was, now you could look back with fond memories where it's been, well, geez, that would have been 8 years ago, roughly. with it. So, or 27, 28 years. Now you can look back with fond memories, but I was really beat up. That was grade 10 that it happened. And that was the first death I'd ever experienced. And, when you experience that as growing up, that's a traumatic thing. And that really beat up my family, really, because we had that close relationship and stuff too. So, don't waste those moments. Make sure you take advantage of them, because you never know if that could be the last time you hang out with that person or see them.
No, absolutely. And what was some of the relationship like as you guys were getting into those early middle school years? I know we talked about him picking you guys up and helping you out with the paper route, but how did some of the relationships change a little bit over time?
I don't know if it changed. I mean, obviously he wasn't bouncing us on his knees when we were, 12 years old or 14 years old. My grandfather wasn't the type to have deep talks, like he wasn't talking about the birds and the bees and, stuff like that. You knew that he loved you and he cared, and that was no doubt about that. But I don't know if the relationship ever changed. I think it was kept very consistent, other than, like, I made a joke about bouncing on the knees. But I remember it was probably, we were 12, 13 years old. He was still playing baseball with us. He had come out, he'd see us playing in the field. He'd say, "Give me the bat." And he would start hitting the fly balls out to us. So I hope that I could be like that when I'm 70-ish years old, to be going out and playing baseball is pretty cool, because a lot of 70-year-olds aren't doing that.
No, absolutely. And in fact, I talked to my old high school buddies about their grandfather. When we all played Little League together, their grandfather came out, and during the summers, he was always out there on the field warming up the pitchers in between the innings. Yeah. At that time, we couldn't let the kids, when I was playing, so they wouldn't allow us to run out there without full kind of catcher equipment and stuff. But, an old man can run out there with a catcher's mitt and warm up a kid, no problem. So they didn't care about old people, but,
So I like the older generations where, I mean, God, they were fighting in world wars, kids going overseas to fight the Nazis and everything else, and they weren't the types to complain about it, right? But nowadays, today's generation is much different.
One question I do have for you, though, is your grandfather's boat named Mathew and Marc. And looking back at it, does that bring up any memories or anything for your grandfather to name it that versus, Lucky Day or, 100 different names?
Yeah. What was the one I saw the other day? Someone named their boat. They were a tech entrepreneur or something, and they named it Not Online, but it was KNOT, Not Online. Don't mind me. I'm bad for puns and, dad jokes and things. To answer your question, I mean, I was definitely very proud of it. It was really cool, to say to people, hey, you look out there, you can see the boats on the water out in the Bay of Fundy, and you know that there's a boat out there with your name on it. So it was kind of sad when I heard that it sold after he passed away and stuff like that. And it was just a nice gesture. We were his first grandchildren there, and I thought that was a nice gesture when we were born to do that.
Yeah, no, that was a special, nod to the grandkids.
Yeah, well, grandparents, they have the fun job, right? They don't have to usually do much with disciplining and all that other stuff. They get to spoil the grandkids rotten. They have the fun time, and then it's the parents who often have to be the bad guy or the bad girl in the mother's case with it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I talked with a number of people where, part of what they say that role of grandfather is that, we just love these kids unconditionally. We try to meet them where they're at, connect with them, and the day-to-day expectations and everything is for the parents, but the grandfathers have a unique perspective where they can be a little bit more of a mentor role and I don't know, maybe a little bit more strategic in thinking.
Yeah, they're not the ones grounding the kid, if they're caught drinking or they take the car without permission or they're skipping school or whatever. In most cases, I know some do. But I think grandparents are a really important, vital role, grandmothers included as well. And I don't know, I think things have changed somewhat over the years, of course, like it always does. But I think that in society, that's still recognized that way, and in certain cultures, especially, that's the patriarch of the family in a lot of cases.
Right. Now, did you have anything, other special activities with your grandfather outside of baseball that you guys did, where it's like, hey, I don't know, spring's here, we're going to go do this. This is what me and Grandpa, or me, Matt, and Grandpa go do.
Yeah. Well, I remember he had a snowmobile, and he had quite a bit of acreage behind the house. And I can remember him taking us out on the trails, zipping around and stuff. And I can still remember the smell of gasoline, right? And you're all bundled up in your coat and you're zipping around there. One thing that I do remember, which is strange now to think about it, he had an old blue truck, and it wasn't exactly a, race car. But I remember once I was in the vehicle with him. My brother was in the vehicle with my father. And there's two different ways to get home from our community. And basically, we raced. This is terrible. I guess I hope my insurance guy isn't listening. I don't drive like this, by the way. I always stick to the speed limit. But I can remember them zipping down these country roads to get home, and just, it sounded cool at the time. Probably a little dangerous, now that I think about it. But it's funny that you would think that a grandfather and his son, my father, would be racing, to see which is the quicker way, if it's one way to get home or the other. And I can't remember who won with it. And thankfully, we didn't hit any dogs or any people or anything like that. But that was only once that I remember with it. And it's funny what stands out when you think. I kind of forgot that story till we got talking about it.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is too, is that it's interesting what comes to mind when you've had enough perspective and distance that comes back, because now it's bringing up stuff that eventually, you might go, oh, I had such a good time with my grandfather doing that. When I've got the grandkids, we're going to do something, here's some activities and here's some things similar that meant a lot to me, that hopefully will mean a lot to those grandkids. Yeah.
Well, I think in life, it's really important if you want to live a long life, you have to stay youthful and not just, there's a lot of senior citizens, they retire, and then you always hear these stories, they die shortly after because they had a purpose before, and then all of a sudden they have no routine, they're not seeing the same people. It may sound like fun if you could go fishing every day, or just sit on your lazy boy and just relax. But you also need that, some other things, for happy life. So I don't know. I think that I hope, knock on wood, that when I'm a grandfather, that I'm still doing things like playing sports and doing some things to keep that youthful edge going, and you don't suddenly just say, okay, yeah, I'm old and the end is near, because God, nowadays people are living past 100 in a lot of cases. So
yeah, no, absolutely. Now, do you have another story that stands out that you'd like to share? Because I'd like to wrap up with a great story that you might have that you haven't shared, and then also talk a little bit about any impressions that you have about your relationship that you think other grandfathers could take advantage of.
Well, for stories, one story that sticks out is I mentioned my grandfather wasn't the type to always show like a lot of emotion, and have those deep heart-to-heart talks, but you knew that he cared. We had an instance once where we were eating supper at our place. My father started choking, like it was chicken or something went down the wrong pipe, and he was like on the ground gasping for air. And I can remember both my grandparents immediately being right over there, and you can just see the concern in their eyes from it. And I'd never seen that from them. Here they are looking at my father, who's their son, who was choking, and they're thinking, oh my God, is he going to die or whatever? And that humanized them a little bit with it, not in a bad way, in a good way, I think, because you realize that how much they cared for family, and that they did have those emotions, just they didn't always show it, that generation hides them a little bit more so than nowadays with it. So that's one story that does stand out. It's not a happy story like some of the others, but I think that it's one that showed that how much they cared for their family.
No, but that's important too, because you're not the first person that's brought up, whether generational or cultural or whatnot, that, you know, people understood that they were loved by their grandparents or their parents. And I think sometimes as a child or a young person, you don't always know. You don't always pick up on other little cues that let you know that no, they really do care. So having that experience though is very positive, and you know, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no problem. Now, what was the other question? I'm sorry.
Sure. You know, anything from that relationship you had with your grandfather that you would think would be helpful for other grandfathers like myself to keep in our minds?
Like I talked about earlier, just a reminder. For the grandfather, I think it's important to stay engaged in your grandkids' lives. You know, do things that they're interested in. In my case, it was baseball. When I'm that age, God knows, some virtual reality type video simulation or something. I don't know. My kid's into Minecraft. That's all he does nowadays. So I make an effort to play Minecraft and things with him. But yeah, be engaged with your kids. Ask them, you know, how things are going. Look for any signs of something going wrong. You know, nowadays it's tough for kids because there's social media and all these things that weren't around when we were growing up. It was tough enough being a kid when I was growing up, but now you have to worry about being bullied online. You got social media, you've got all shaming, you've got just a lot of things on a kid's plate. So sometimes a kid may not be comfortable talking with their parents. Maybe the grandfather, grandmother, they could get it out of them if they see that something's off a little bit with it. So that would be one piece of advice. Great. Thank you. Now, as we wrap up, anything that we didn't cover that you would like to bring up or talk about? Well, he was great on the harmonica. I remember him playing the harmonica and tapping his foot and stuff like that. So that was another thing that comes to mind with it. It seems like such a simpler life back then. You didn't have smartphones attached to you 24/7, and people still lived. And I do kind of miss that. I even experienced some of that growing up. Nowadays, you got your phone. People can't go to the washroom without bringing their iPhone with them. So I don't know. I think, it's. I know I sound probably a lot older than I actually am because I'm thinking of back in the quote good old days and sound like an old fogey. But I like a lot of things about the older generations than our current one. Oh, I can totally relate. And about the harmonica, some of my best memories are my grandfather playing the harmonica, whether we're driving in his old Dodge pickup truck or sitting around his kitchen farmhouse table, and him just pulling that out and playing that and just enjoying those times. Yeah, it was good times, and very community minded, in that community I don't know, Maces Bay probably had 500 people, wasn't it? And then there's the surrounding communities, but very much so people wouldn't lock their doors. Your Friday nights, Saturday nights, you'd be going around visiting people all over the community. And it's funny, I went back to Maces Bay recently. I don't get back often, maybe once a year. I had to remind myself when I was driving to keep my hand up on the steering wheel to wave to every single person who drove by, because I'm like, geez, I forgot. I've been used to living in, now I'm not living in Atlanta like you, but I'm used to living in cities with 100,000 people, so it's not a small city. Nobody's waving, they might be flipping the bird or something at them. So I go back home to Maces Bay after I'm to keep my hand up because there's a car coming from the opposite direction. Without fail, they're going to be waving to me. Yeah, you got to do. On top of the steering wheel thing, the raise your fingers up. Yeah. Years ago, I rented a Jeep for a few days when I sold a vehicle, and I was between when I sold my vehicle and when I was going to get my new one. There's a couple days that I rented the Jeep. I never drove a Jeep in my life. That's like a cult. Now that one I was driving around the city because I lived in the city. I had no idea Jeep people were so fanatical about it. Every single time a Jeep came the other way, I did the same thing. I'd get my hand up on the steering wheel and I said to my girlfriend, I'm like, oh, watch this. I could spot a Jeep like way far away. I'm like, watch us. Like, that's like where you talk about, get my hand up and I wave because that's what it's like. It's probably the same with Harley Davidson owners and stuff like that. Yeah, see it all the time with the motorcycle guys, and theirs is more of their left hand is down low, kind of stuck out.
But yeah,
it's
definitely.
cool. Yeah, they're the cooler way to do it. But yeah, it's Jeep owners have a unique bond as well.
Oh, absolutely. Well, Marc, where could people get in touch with you or follow you?
Yeah, so the main site's naturalborncoaches.com. That's got everything, around coaching in there, the podcast episodes and so on. I also have a Facebook group for coaches or people interested in coaching, and that's called the Coaching Jungle. There's about 21,000 coaches in there at the moment, and that's at thecoachingjungle.com.
Okay. And folks, what we'll do is we'll put links to those in the show notes as well. So if you want to head over to the website, I'll have all those links there for you. Marc, thanks again so much for being on the Cool Grandpa podcast. And I do appreciate this conversation that we've had. So thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Greg. I appreciate it.
Wow, what a great conversation with Marc. My big takeaway from this conversation was that we shouldn't be wasting time and shouldn't waste those moments and opportunities where we have to check in with each other to see how the day's going, and to especially be able to have meaningful conversations with grandparents or parents or just anybody that's in your network and those folks that you love, because tomorrow is not guaranteed. I mean, Marc, you heard it, went over, saw his grandfather at his mother's urging, went over, said, hey, hung out for a little bit, didn't have, deep conversations. But then a few days later, unfortunately, Marc's grandfather passed away. And that was the last time that he saw his grandfather in his element, in the workshop, talking about baseball, talking about life. It's a memory that obviously is stuck with Marc for a long time and meant a lot to him, to the point where Marc pushed and launched his daily podcast on the anniversary of his grandfather's passing. So do me a favor, shoot me that email. Again, my email address is greg@cool-grandpa.com. Let me know what your big takeaway was from this conversation I had with Marc. Now, as you go about your day, remember, reach out, make that phone call. Don't waste time. And remember, be cool. Thank you for listening to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and share it with a friend. That's the best way you can help us to expand our community, as well as get the news out about how valuable grandpas are in the lives of those kids. If you'd like to leave me a comment or shoot me a potential topic for this podcast, please go to www.cool-grandpa.us. Look for the comments tab, fill it out, hit submit. It's as easy as that. Until next time, remember to stay cool.